Thank you so much for joining us for this Shapiro lecture. I am very happy to welcome you to this. The Shapiro lectures are such an important part of the annual events that take place at CTU. They enrich our perspectives and help us to understand more profoundly what our mission in the world really is. I am very confident that tonight's lecture will be an extremely illuminating one, and I am extremely impressed with our speaker, who will be introduced by Malka later on. But I hate to begin this evening with a sad note, and that is I would like to say that CTU and the rest of our community are at one with the Jewish community of Vienna at the moment, because of the terrible loss of life that has taken place there by terrorists in Vienna. Unfortunately, the reality of the world constantly impinges on our own scholarship and our own way of looking at really what needs to be done in terms of helping relationships between all religions. And Dr. Brill will be able to help us with that this evening. So I simply would like to welcome you, show our solidarity with the Jewish community in Vienna, and thank you so much for joining us for the Shapiro lecture.
Thank you, Father Mark. And I want to also thank you for all your support over the years in being just so wonderful, supporting our program, the Catholic Jewish Studies program. This is Father Mark's last Shapiro lecture before his retirement in January, and we all appreciate you so very much. Good evening. My name is Malka Simkovich, and I am the Crown Ryan Chair of Jewish Studies and Director of the Catholic Jewish Studies program at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. I am delighted to welcome you all to this year's Fall Shapiro Lecture. This evening is bittersweet for us at CTU, since it is the first time that the Catholic Jewish Studies program is not hosting one of its 3 annual Shapiro Lectures in person. Those of you from the Chicagoland area who have attended our Shapiro Lectures in the past know very well how rewarding they are, not only because they afford those in the Chicago community the opportunity to learn from world-class Jewish studies scholars in person, but also because of the opportunity to interact directly with these scholars and with audience members from different faiths. The act of attending a Shapiro lecture is an act of interreligious engagement in itself, and one that we at CTU's Bernardine Center cherish and anticipate all year round. Nevertheless, the small silver lining of virtual learning is that we have an opportunity to expand our audience and invite all of you into the CTU learning community. And I'm thrilled to see that we have people tuning in tonight from all over the world to hear our featured speaker, Rabbi Dr. Alan Brill. Dr. Brill is the author of many books, including Judaism and Other Religions, Models of Understanding, published in 2010, Judaism and World Religions, published in 2012, and the recently published Rabbi on the Ganges, a Jewish-Hindu Encounter, published just this past year. Over the past 2 decades, Dr. Brill has forged new paths in interreligious dialogue, partnering with leading thinkers representing Christianity, Islam, and Hinduism, and his research reflects his continual effort to explore new frontiers of interreligious dialogue and understanding. In these extremely challenging and uncertain times, such interreligious encounters are more important than ever, and I know that Dr. Brill's lecture tonight will invite all of us to explore new vistas of learning that we haven't yet encountered. We will leave aside time for questions at the end, but feel free to post your questions in the chat box anytime throughout the lecture, or you can send them directly to me. I will then direct some of these questions to Dr. Brill at the end of the lecture for our Q&A session. Without further ado, please welcome Dr. Alan Brill.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to be here virtually at Catholic Theological Union as an invited speaker. I thank Professor Malka Simkovich for the invitation and the rest of the faculty for making CTU an exciting place for theological exchange. And a happy 80th birthday to Professor John Pawlikowski. Today, I'll talk about a topic that Jews do not usually speak about, which is the Trinity. Jews have usually seen it as tri-theism in past polemical ages, but now it is a post-polemical age. I was thinking about opening with a joke about the Jewish lack of understanding of the Trinity, but instead I'll tell a story. I was in Rome in 2005 for the 40th anniversary of Nostra Aetate. Among the many delegate speakers was a priest who was proud to tell me that he studied at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and he knew Hebrew. At one point over the course of the week, I was standing with my wife in front of the Il Gesù church in Rome. And this priest who was also there walked up to us and said declaratively, "Can't you feel the Shekhinah here?" My wife and I looked at each other about this rabbinic Hebrew locution from the priest that thought it brought us together. He was using a rabbinic and Kabbalistic word, Shekhinah, but what did he mean? On some level, to explain the difference between the Jewish and Catholic meanings reveals the core of this talk. The Mishnah in Tractate Avot 3:2 reads, "But two who are sitting together, and there are words of Torah spoken between them, the divine presence, the Shekhinah, rests with them." In a similar manner, in Matthew 18:20, it says, "From where two or three are gathered together in my name, there I am present in the midst of them." For the latter, the book of Matthew, the divine presence is Christ, or as it eventually becomes formulated, the second person of the Trinity. While in rabbinic literature, the divine presence is a free-floating signifier of divine relationship, which becomes formulated in later centuries in diverse ways, as divine providence, as a metaphor of approval, as an angel, as a docetic apparition, as a Holy Spirit, or even a lower manifestation of the divine as part of the 10 Sefirot. So what is the Shekhinah for Maimonides? It's a created entity of divine light, or a metaphor of divine providence. Other Jews, as I said, will treat it as an angel. But for Christians, it clearly becomes the second person of the Trinity. The meaning of the Shekhinah for Jews is loose and up to interpretation. For Christians, it becomes the dogma and the liturgy, and it becomes fixed. Or to discuss the Trinity and my conclusions up front, so you know where I'm going, Jewish thought is modalist, not Trinitarian. Jewish thought is monarchist, not Trinitarian. Jewish thought is often docetic, not Trinitarian. And Jewish thought leaves the terms for interdivine structures as rather free-floating rather than a fixed creed. Jewish thought is also sometimes Arian, as in the Arian controversy, in which all these lower units are created by God. So in short, as a mean to foreshadow what I will be saying for those who have to go already, in a post-polemical age, the dividing lines between the Jewish view of God and the Trinity has more to do with modalism, monarchism, doceticism, Arianism, and whether the ideas are fixed. Jews and Christians made different decisions in the 3rd and 4th centuries that underlie today's differences, even though we have newfound convergences in our post-polemical age. So let's return a moment to our polemical age. Back in 1943, Trudy Weiss Rosmarin wrote a book called Judaism and Christianity, The Differences. It's treated by many on the congregational level as a classic. She sets out to show the two religions are fundamentally irreconcilable and contradictory. For her, the fundamental divide is that Jews have an undifferentiated monotheism, whereas Christian Trinity is a concession to polytheism. My question tonight is whether the Jewish view of God and the Christian Trinity is irreconcilable or not. And my second question, which we're just going to touch on, is what can we learn from this comparison? During the post-Vatican II era, there was a period of getting acquainted. Books and articles appeared concerning scripture, New Testament, Jewish history, anti-Semitism, Holocaust, but little direct theology. Rabbi Mark Tannenbaum, Rabbi Ben-Zion Buxer, and even Rabbi Abraham Joshua and Heschel did not seriously engage Christian theological topics such as the Trinity. Since the 1990s, there's been a turn toward theology, but almost all Jewish thinkers active in the 1990s still considered Christian theology as inscrutable. Most Jewish thinkers of the 1990s, for example, Rabbi David Novak, believe that Jews cannot understand the Trinity or Christian theology. For him, there's an ultimate impasse between Judaism and Christianity. However, he declares, and despite differences, we can share natural law and morality grounded in the divine. Or Professor Jacob Neusner has another form of that difference of historic essentialism, basically saying that if you look at a 4th, 5th century period, Christians care about belief, the Messiah, atonement, while Jews care about Torah study and the application of law. Jews have a God of the Jews, and Christians have a God of the Christians. Neusner is not entirely wrong, but in an age when Jews read Moltman and Rahner, and Christians read Heschel and Levinas, we need to temper his essentialism. So first, a word about my background. I am a rabbi with a PhD in theology from a Catholic university. So I have a unique position for tonight's talk. I attended Fordham University for my degree in theology, and I was warmly welcomed along with the students of other faiths as a result of the changes brought forth by Vatican II. Today, I can teach Christian theology, and I do not find it incomprehensible. In fact, I took comprehensives on it. In fact, instead of tentatively learning to understand Christianity, I find myself explaining Christian thought to Christians. As someone whose early research was in Kabbalah and the Jewish interdivine structures, I was always aware of both the similarities and differences between Jewish and Christian views of God. This lecture is now the start of my tentative thoughts of how do you compare in a post-polemical age. So the time has come to ask, can we have serious comparisons and contrasts? A pioneer who tried was Pinchas Lapid, Israel's Milanese ambassador. He had wonderful productive dialogues with Moltman, Rahner, Kung back in the 1970s and 80s. For Lapid, Judaism has many metaphysical and logos theories similar to Christianity, and he was willing to compare theologies. And there's a great deal of valuable information and food for thought in those volumes. However, they're marred by the rather by their interview style, their inconsistent recorded episodes without any follow-up or systemization. But we still gain insights as Lapid finding Rahner's modal trinity closer to Judaism's vision of the divine than Moltman's dynamic trinity. My position is that it should not be as simple as same or different, but there's an overlap of different models of interconnection because Jewish thought is diverse, Christian thought is diverse, and over the centuries, there's different configurations that came to be. If I were to break down a Christian idea into 8 or 10 or 12 points, Jews are likely to share about half of them with Christians. And Jews, if I broke down a Jewish idea into 10 or 12 points, we may share a similar amount with Muslims, and we may share some points with Hindus. Hence, religions can be put in others' terms, but only in certain respects. Theological points can be put into a scale of similarity and difference, not a yes-no or a cut and dry same and difference, but a scale of factors in common and those in difference. In many cases, the similarities are due to scriptural or structural connections or philosophic background, So even the differences may show signs of interrelation. It is not much different than comparative exegesis. And my goal is not a quantification of this similarity and differences or an abstract checklist. Rather, my goal is to point out that popular theological language usually fails to break issues into their component parts that need for a full discussion. And so therefore my agenda is just to move beyond the binary thinking. Now, interreligious comparisons, as people have noted, is a field of tension between both similarity and difference, between a sense of religious interconnection and the recognition of the distinctiveness of the other tradition. To understand other religions, we have to penetrate the mindset of the other. And following Levinas, we need to accept hospitality and go out of our comfort zones to actually learn about the other. Or as sociologist Peter Berger stated, our discussion should really be on our disagreements, that an open-minded encounter with other religious possibilities on the level of their claims. Before I turn to the last 50 years with the theories of Karl Rahner and Jurgen Moltman, I need to address the differences in late antiquity, the location where we created our fundamental differences. And I want to note that while there's many variances in the rabbinic corpus and many variances in the patristic corpus, this is just to give a certain language by which, if you're going to stake out the differences, on how you should stake it out. The first dealing with interdivine structures and bitheism. Jewish theology is not, like Herman Cohen portrayed Judaism, as an abstract monotheism having nothing to do with historic texts. Many current scholars demonstrate the widespread ideas of complex structure of the divine in first century Judaism, including various forms of binitarianism and bitheism within Judaism. The idea of a complex Godhead have their origins in the Judaism of the first century and before. So Peter Schaeffer and Larry Hurtado show the complex overlaps of the ideas of the divine. Daniel Boyarin calls on Jews to stop vilifying Christian ideas about God as simply a collection of un-Jewish, perhaps pagan ideas. And Moshe Dell put out a 600-page tome on concepts of sonship within Jewish thinking about God, including treating the logos into divine structures and bitheism as a son. So to put aside pure Jewish monotheism versus Christian Trinitarianism. Point number 2, the abstract high God. And this is addressed more for my Jewish audience. Paula Fredrickson notes that during the 2nd century, that Jew and Gentile Christians divided on the Jewish God, where Christians considered the high God of the Jewish tradition as the high God of the philosophers. And they insisted that this high God was the Father of Christ. But they assumed the high God was not active in Jewish scriptures, hence it was the Son that was active in the Bible. So from their reading of it, the Hebrew Bible, the active force is the Son. So for Christians, the God of the Hebrew Bible is the Son, who has change, passion, sorrow, love, who does revelation, who does hear prayers. While for Jews, the God of the Bible is the active God, the God the Father, or the God abstract God, who has a special relationship with Jews. Point number 3, monarchism. Judaism is through and through monarchist, which is a word of Christian heresy from the patristic period, that for Jews there's a hierarchy of the divine parts. The Shekhinah or Gevurah or Kavod or anything other word Jews use for an interdivine part is always lower than the infinite divine, than the cause of causes. The Shekhinah and the infinite divine are not indwelling together like the Trinity. Christianity is explicitly anti-monarchist. In fact, it treats it as a heresy. For Christianity, they use a word, perichoresis, meaning the parts indwell together, and they're mutually interrelated without hierarchy. Judaism keeps a hierarchy. So even in the early centuries of Jewish bitheism, Jews kept it as a hierarchy, and all the more so later theories of the kavod, the divine glory, and Kabbalah always kept the hierarchy. Another basic term, modalism, modalism is where the divine parts are just modes or attributes of one God. For Jewish philosophers, for the entire rational tradition, almost anything you say about God, all-knowing, all-powerful, benevolent, or providence, is nothing but an attribute, modalism. Now we have 20th century Christian thinkers who skirt close to modalism, and we're going to see Moltman will reject this. Jews then spent half a millennium under Islam, where Jews learned Kalam and emphasized the absolute oneness of God, versus Christians in Europe, who tended to develop the personalist thoughts of Peter Abelard, Richard of St. Victor, and others who were much more personalist than late antiquity. But nevertheless, medieval Jewish philosophers, such as Saadia, saw Jews, Christians, and Muslims as all sharing of the belief in the monotheistic unity of God. So in medieval polemics of Jews and Christians, Jews said they speak of the divine as modalism, though they didn't use that word, and Christians tended to argue a personhood. So, for example, in the 13th century, the disputation in Barcelona, when Nachmanides writes that Fra Pablo asked me in Gerona whether I believed in the Trinity. I said to him, "What is the Trinity?" He answered, "Wisdom, will, and power." I said to him, "He and his wisdom are one, and he and his will are one, and his power are one. And if so, wisdom, will, and power are all just attributes of the one. Even if God had accidental qualities, they would not be a trinity, but they would all be in one substance." In short, Nachmanides gave a modal answer if we're looking at reading it not as polemics, but as what we can learn from it. Other Jewish thinkers, such as Isaac Albalog, the Maimonidean, explicitly wrote, if you frame things in terms of attributes, then possibly we could agree. Now turning to our contemporary theologies of Trinity, where I'm going to look at Karl Rahner and then Jurgen Moltman. Karl Rahner, who died in 1984, the German Jesuit priest, who is widely considered to have been one of the foremost Roman Catholic theologians of the 20th century, and is known for his integration of existential philosophy of personalism with Thomistic realism. He was an influential presence at Vatican II and was personally friendly with Abraham Joshua Heschel. So he goes out of his way to say the three parts of the Trinity do not have separate consciousness or personhood. In fact, there are no three persons, but three volitions in one essence. And there's no classic procession of the parts. He basically undoes much of the internal process in the Trinity in which all proceeds from the Father, in that all are three substances as modes of a single God. Rahner avoids the word person about the Trinity because he says in the modern era, person means consciousness and activity, but the Trinity has only one consciousness. And the difference between the persons, therefore, are not abstract and fixed, but relative. Now, Catholic theologians who write reviews of Rahner or include him in their textbooks usually repeat a standard set of evaluations of his view of the Trinity. Among these include that Rahner is weak on the role of persons, and that this is close to the charge of modalities. But from my point of view, these criticisms actually bring his view of the Trinity closer to a Jewish perspective. But our question is, how close? Since modalism is a position that Judaism can accept, it's important to reflect a bit longer on this question. Mark Puglisi, a scholar of modern Catholic thought, in an important article, Is Karl Rahner a Modalist?, concludes that Rahner is not, in fact, a modalist, but the conclusion of the article may put its finger on the Jewish-Christian divide in our age. For Puglisi, the question of modalism can be reduced to two chief concerns. One, whether Rahner's theory can lead to denying the necessary eternal numerical distinctions in God. Two, Rahner says God is only one absolute person, not a plurality of three subjectivities. Rahner seeks to explain what the church means by person. They're not masks divorced from the content of the deity, but rather that without them, the substantive real deity could not exist. So this position that Rahner rejects, saying that they're just masks, is the very perspective that Judaism is most comfortable with. For much of the God language within Judaism, we're very happy saying it's just masks. And where Puglisi says that you can't say that all the parts of the Trinity don't have volition, Jews do not say their interdivine structures, at least since antiquity, have volition. So in Kabbalah, the Sfirot express God, but they don't remain separate persons than God. They're not separate. They don't have independence. They don't have volition. That's why they're called emanations. They're forces or mediums to act within the world and for God to relate to the world. And in many late 20th and early 21st century readings of the Kabbalistic scheme, these interdivine structures are treated as a mechanism or a computer that the divine uses, certainly not persons. And even more so, the Kabbalah is only one stream within Judaism. Contemporary rational Aristotelian or Neo-Kantian Jewish philosophy would not tolerate any interdivine parts. By contrast, the doctrine of the Trinity is at the very heart of Christianity. And at some level, we have much of the distinctions right here. But it's not a binary. The second theologian I want to consider is Jurgen Moltman, professor of systematic theology at the University of Tübingen in Germany, one of the most widely read theologians of the second half of the 20th century and the start of the 21st. And I'm going to deal with one of his early works where he engages freely with Jewish thought. He's still in his 90s, still writing, and he's actively engaged with dialogue with contemporary Jewish scholars. But Moltman says he has self-proclaimed distinctly Christian understanding of God, knowing what the Jewish view is. For Moltman, the cross of the Son stands from eternity in the center of the Trinity. Moltman focuses not only on the suffering of God, even more the suffering within God. Moltman's doctrine of God does not start with the divine unity, like Thomas Aquinas, but he starts already with the divine plurality and the divine mission of the Trinity, and that's called a social doctrine of the Trinity. Now, his theological thinking starts with the carnage and tragedy of World War II, and therefore he starts with the sense of suffering after World War II and the Holocaust. He will go out of his way to start his thinking on suffering with the Jewish thought of Elie Wiesel and the thought of Abraham Joshua Heschel's most moved mover. He seeks to create a Trinitarian view in which God shares in our suffering, and he looks to Jewish sources. Moltman writes that it's not merely possible to see Golgotha and Auschwitz in a single perspective, it's absolutely necessary. Now, parenthetically, there was a debate almost 50 years ago about Moltman's approach. Some 1970s Christian theologians of the Holocaust blame the Holocaust directly on Christian teachings, not distinguishing between the teachings of contempt and the teachings of the Trinity. Father Palakowski remembers this time and actually wrote about it at the time. And it was another reason for the lack of the sort of discussion we're having tonight, because it was not particularly productive at the time. We're not going to deal with that debate of 50 years ago, but it's important to bring out how it precluded some of the discussion. Now, be that as it may about that debate, in the Trinity and the Kingdom, Moltman's first section is on the immanent indwelling of God. And he starts his book saying, the passion of God is based on Jewish sources. And he starts off saying Jews and Christians come from the same spiritual neighborhood. Even the Christian ideas of incarnation of the divine, Logos, Holy Spirit, are in the same spiritual neighborhood as the early ideas of exilic and rabbinic Shekhinah theology. And I'm not dealing with the first centuries, I'm dealing with the 20th century parts of this. Moltman wrote that Tertullian's formulation of the Trinity is, of course, using the terminology of Greek philosophy of the Neoplatonists. But Moltman continues, as the New Testament shows, in actual fact, it goes back to the Israelite theology of the Shekhinah. The God who lives in heaven and among the wretched of his people reveals a double presence. What Abraham Joshua Heschel, in his interpretation of the prophets, calls a bipolarity. The rabbinic mystical doctrine of the Shekhinah, according to Moltman, is one of the primary theological frameworks he uses to interpret his own as well as the world's experience of suffering. Moltman starts his Trinitarian work with Elie Wiesel's experience of a shattering expression of our life within the world and its suffering. However, Moltman concludes that whereas the Jewish understanding of the Shekhinah tradition perceived a kind of double presence, or Heschel's bipolarism, the Christian experience perceived a kind of triple presence. So it's not a Jewish abstract God as formulated by Herman Cohen versus a Christian Trinitarianism. But if we go back to the roots of these common ideas of bitheism and Shekhinah and others, this is a place to bridge and to talk about. Moltman uses Heschel, his arguments against the passionless God, to describe a God who is freely affected and changed by the suffering world. Moltman is also heavily influenced by Franz Rosenzweig's Star of Redemption in its discussion of the Shekhinah suffering with us. For Moltman, the people suffer exile and persecution, and the Shekhinah suffers with them. The Shekhinah suffers exile, and the people suffer the Shekhinah. And he actually cites as a proof for this the rabbinic Mishnah in Sanhedrin 6:5. When a human being suffers, what does the Shekhinah say? My head is too heavy for me. My arm is too heavy for me. And if God is so grieved over the blood of the wicked that is shed, how much more so over the blood of the righteous? So we have a Christian reading of a Mishnah saying that God feels bad when anyone is executed as an affirmation of the second person of the Trinity. Now, returning back to Heschel, Heschel's concept of God is wholly free in God's self, and at the same time committed to the people of God and covenant and affected by history. Moltman picks this up, and I quote, Heschel has shown that the Jewish experience of God cannot be a simple monotheism, because on the basis of the experience of the divine pathos, it must come to be aware of the self-distinction of God. Every self-communication presupposes a self-distinction. Whoever speaks of the communicability of God presupposes a relationship in which God can step over against God. Now that's quote from Moltman reading Heschel, but I must point out that for both Heschel and most Jewish thought, these lower entities still remain in a hierarchy. Yet, Moltman himself notes another difference from Judaism, that unlike Christianity, for Jews, deliverance is ostensibly in the hands of human beings. Human action is what counts for redemption in Judaism. Moltman also points out that for Jews who do mitzvot, the Jews fulfill their endless number of precepts for the sake of uniting the holy God and his Shekhinah, which is not in Christianity. He will play with that in essays later in his life, but at this point he's clearly demarcating in a very different place. The next level of Moltman, dealing with God's suffering, Moltman turns to the Kabbalistic idea of Tzimtzum as presented by Gershon Shalom. And Moltman asks, can the omnipotent God have an outward aspect at all? In order to answer this question, Moltman discusses Isaac Luria's doctrine of Tzimtzum. And according to Gershon Shalom, as read by Moltman with his Trinitarian perspective, Tzimtzum means contraction or concentration. And it signifies a withdrawal into the self rather than from the world. Luria, taking up a midrashic teaching, according to Moltman, refers to God as concentrating his Shekhinah, and he transforms this teaching into God's concentrated form. Moltman's understanding of this is that God has released a certain sector of his being from which he has withdrawn, a kind of primal mystical space, and into this accordingly, he issues himself into creation and into revelation. This means the exit of creation becomes a self-humiliation of God's part when he determines to be self-limiting. It is through this withdrawal, this exile into God's own self, that allows for the nihilo, in which God then actively creates. Transposing this completely into a Trinitarian key, Moltman writes that the relationship of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit is so wide that the whole creation can find space-time and freedom in it. I mean, he treats the Trinity as performing the Tzimtzum. So Tzimtzum to Moltman means incarnation and kenosis, and he identifies both with the Shekhinah and Tzimtzum. But as I was preparing this lecture, I'm writing to myself, at this point, no, in capital letters. Tzimtzum does not mean Shekhinah, and it does not mean an entity of God. It means a hollow, a withdrawal of God, a gap in which there is then an empty space filled with a hierarchy of divine light or divine energy. But the Tzimtzum itself is not the Trinity. It is not the self-revelation of God. In fact, it's the hollow in which we go looking for God's revelation. For Moltman, Christ solves the void, while for Jews, the void is a Kabbalistic cosmology, a structure of reality, a chain of emanations. Tzimtzum in Jewish thought remains a hierarchical emanation, or it remains an illusion of this world, but it doesn't mean God is the one contracting. As might be, God is contracting, but not, he is the contraction. As might be expected, according to Moltman, God's self-humiliation, his Tzimtzum is ultimately realized and is nowhere greater than on the cross. Moltman presupposes a self-humiliation inward, a Tzimtzum that is the culmination of a history of divine self-humiliation, the goal of which is the very redemption of creation and reconciliation of all things to God. The Trinitarian event, as Moltman understands it, is deepened by the Shekhinah tradition, because the Son of the Triune God, like the Shekhinah, participates in humankind's destiny. making the suffering of his people his own. The Shekhinah accompanies Israel into the humiliation of the exile and through the exile into the desert during biblical times. Moltman writes that Christ experiences the humiliation of the cross, the exile of death, and there coexists in solidarity, awaiting resurrection and return. Moltman argues that on the cross, the Father and the Son are so deeply separated that their relationship is cut off. When the Son suffers death, the Father suffers the death of the Son. Now, this isn't in Judaism, and more so in Judaism, when you say the kavod, the divine glory, followed the Israelites in the desert, Jews automatically assume that's a lower creation. Whether you say it's metaphor, you say it's a created entity, whether you say it's a light, even the philosophers like Saadia Gaon or Maimonides had to deal with what is this glory, but none of them are identifying it with God itself. The hierarchy remains. And then finally, Moltman's third movement of God's redemption. Moltman at this point departs from the Shekhinah tradition by understanding the eschatological union to be entrusted to the third person of the Trinity, the Spirit. But he bends over backwards to try to show that the church's own participation with the Spirit is a form of tikkun olam, closer to Judaism, in the uniting of human beings with one another, and the uniting of society with nature, and the uniting of creation with God. So now I want to reflect on Moltman's Trinity and the Shekhinah tradition for a moment. The Shekhinah tradition helped Moltman arrive at a divine unity with the theological concept of the divine indwelling. But Jews don't see the indwelling for all the reasons I outlined at the start. Jews remain modalism, hierarchy, doceticism. And how is he different on more general issues? Jews have a self-tikkun, a self-fixing of the world. And Jews think the action is entrusted to Israel through their covenant, through the keeping of the covenant, or to use the language of Pur Rakur. The root metaphor for the two are very different. For Jews, it's mitzvot, Sinai. And for Christianity, it does become the Christology and the Passion. Moltman himself expresses reservations in the way in which he takes up the Jewish tradition. He admits that the Jewish tradition does not permit the full and real presence of God in his Shekhinah and his Spirit to be thought. Now, if you sit back and ask, what was this all about? A scholar of Moltman, Mueller Fahrenhaus Geico, who I've never met, asks in his book on Moltman, how do we evaluate Moltman's use of Judaism? Is it compatibility? Is it a typology? He says Moltman seems to be himself unsure. And he says Moltman questions his own use, but then uses it anyway. So Geico concludes that Moltman has it both ways. For Geico, he says, I have my doubt whether Jewish theologians could regard Moltman's argument, which all too quickly moves from questions to a supposition, as compelling exegesis of the Jewish tradition. Yet Moltman himself tries to close the gap between Judaism and Christianity whenever he can. So what do I take from this comparison? For Christians, the Trinity is a fixed theological view of God, affirmed in the Creed and the liturgy. However, the whole rainbow of Jewish expressions of God is and remains a gallery of images which neither are now nor ever have been stone-hard concepts in which one could build a putative knowledge of God. All these images are metaphor toward the unutterable. Judaism has no fixed divine configuration, so it varies from negative theology to thousands of divine parts, from philosophic metaphor to Hindu complexity. Or all the more so for Jews, the Father is a metaphor for the relationship of the Jewish people and God, but not a real relationship of God as Father and Son, as in Christianity. And even if we look at how the Shekhinah developed in Jewish thought, it developed as a feminine concept, it developed as bridal, and it adapted much of the biblical imagery of bride and mother, making it much closer to Hindu imagery than to the rather fixed male imagery of Moltman. Yet regarding theology in general, Karl Rahner and Jurgen Moltman's willingness to enter into theological dialogue with various Jewish scholars discussed above stands as an exemplary model of the many possibilities authentic interreligious dialogue produce. Leonard Swidler, the great theoretician of interfaith dialogue, writes in his foreword to the publication of the Lapid-Moltman dialogue that this particular conversation alone yielded exciting new insights into the meaning of reality that neither alone had more than an inkling of. As a result, each is more profoundly a Jew and a Christian, respectively, but at the same time is profoundly closer to each other. Moltman's indebtedness to the Shekhinah tradition is a particular example of the promise of comparative theology. A modal theological position such as Rahner's is less different than a Jewish philosophic understanding, and a greater Trinitarian position veers to separate persons, and volition is the greater difference. But it's no longer monotheism versus tritheism. After Rahner, if we look at Rahner, the debate is about volition and the interdivine structure and about whether these structures are eternal. So does the Shekhinah have volition, and is it eternal or not? The comparison is not clear black and white. And the difference from Moltman is more fundamental of a person's hierarchy and the nature of religious language, but once again, not black or white. So what do we learn from this exercise? Cardinal Casper, in his book on the Trinity, which I did not discuss tonight, some of you notice I left out Trinitarian doctrines after these two, reminds us that the Trinity is the unique Christian understanding of God, which is unlike the unique Jewish understanding of God, even if both are based in the Hebrew Bible and the thought of earlier centuries. I do not want to elide the difference or make the Jewish and Christian readings as the same. I don't want to conflate the two religions, but as I've repeated, I want to move beyond the idea that Judaism has a pristine monotheism and Christianity has something that Jews just can't understand. I do want to move understanding that Jewish thought has many elements of pre-Nicene Council thought, organized in a different manner so that neither side is a zero-sum irreconcilable difference, rather some elements the same and some elements different. And now we have mutual influence on each other. In the two religions, they differ, one centered on Sinai and one on the Passion of Christ. They have different views of the covenant. As I remind often, when Christians will talk about the covenant, for Jews, the covenant as expressed in the 5 books of Moses is circumcision, Sabbath, and the Torah. And for Christians, the covenant is an opening to God's saving presence. This difference in meaning and covenant was actually my talk 15 years ago in Rome on the anniversary of Nostra Aetate. Now, in a classroom, this is the point when I would now go to the whiteboard and I would give a dozen criteria of same and difference, and let's go through them one at a time, which is in Rahner, which is in Moltman, what are our leftovers, and everyone can now evaluate it. But here in this context that I'm not going to now give a handout or put it on a whiteboard, I will conclude back on the steps of the Gesso in Rome on that breezy autumn day when my colleague priest sought commonality of the Shekhinah of our common 1st and 2nd century ideas. It did not create commonality, but as much commonality and difference. Much has happened in the 15 years since that meeting in Rome. Jewish scholars regularly speak in Christian schools, as I do tonight. Christian scholars regularly speak in Jewish schools, and we both read each other's works, and we both do graduate study under each other. This talk would not have occurred 15 years ago, when the elder scholars on both sides still did not know enough about each other's theology and still saw irreconcilable differences. Now we have started comparing. I hope this talk will be the start of many conversations of even greater understanding.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Dr. Brill. That's incredible. Thank you very, very much. We have a number of questions in the chat box, and I'm going to direct you to the first one sent earlier this hour. Glenn Lewandowski asks, during the first 3 centuries, when Jewish Christians were prominent, were the Jewish Christians modalist? Would the conversation have been more friendly to the Jewish mindset?
So at that point, we don't have the same separations. We've got a lot of all sorts of interdivine structures that are out there, and the full study of everything out there in the first centuries is, now that we don't talk clearly about the ways parting, now that we realize it's much more complex and that the ways never parted on some level, then it's not a simple answer. It's a whole separate discussion than on one foot. But yes, you will find positions that were out there in the early centuries that were much closer.
Well, this is actually relevant to Dr. Yoni Miller's comment later on, who notes that some editions of the Mishnah do not have the word Shekhinah, not in the major manuscript traditions. So was there some editorial workings going on there, do you think?
So actually, without the word, I didn't going to go into that. Without the word Shekhinah, it's actually closer to the Greek of the New Testament, because it's the divine is with them. Do I think there's an editorial hand? Yes, I do, because obviously the divine couldn't be present. It's got to be the Shekhinah. So we're already moving into Jews being much more framing things as a hierarchy, because it can't be anything else.
Mm-hmm. Fascinating. Wow.
Or at least I'm not coming that as a Talmud scholar. I'm saying that as a scholar of Jewish thought who definitely had to rework texts, that it always had to be a hierarchy.
Thank you. Oh, and Yoni adds, to clarify, it's the Mishnah about divine suffering in Sanhedrin, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to respect our planning of this program. We were aiming to offer you a 1-hour program. So I think that we're going to bring our lecture to a close. And I want to thank once again, Dr. Alan Brill, for delivering this outstanding and thought-provoking talk. I was taking notes eagerly the whole time, and I have a lot to look up myself. And I also want to thank the Shapiro Foundation for their sponsorship. I want to thank Mr. Peter Cunningham and Ms. Colleen Urbaniak of Catholic Theological Union for their help and support in planning this program. Please stay tuned for our upcoming events this year, including the Winter Shapiro Lecture, which will be delivered by Dr. Rebecca Sharlock-Wallenberg on March 1st, and the Spring Shapiro Lecture, which will be delivered by Dr. Christine Hayes on April 19th. I look forward to coming together with all of you again very soon. Thank you so much.